Thank you for that welcome. That's really kind of you to say that. I'll pay you later. And thank you for having me here. It's such a privilege to worship with you on this wonderful Sunday morning and to just share fellowship together, but also to hear about this vision of everything matters, to hear what we've been just exposed to, that sense of vision and calling, whether it be to working in climate change or working in the government or working in the city. It's wonderful to be amongst Christians who are thinking these thoughts. And thank you to Dave and Philippa, amazing leaders in our country. And this church is, I think, really leading the way in what God's doing in our generation. So keep going, and thank you for having me. If you have your Bibles, I'd love you to turn to John's Gospel, chapter 8. And we're going to be thinking for a few moments together about one statement that Jesus Christ made in his ministry on earth. And as you know, Jesus said a lot of things, and a lot of things have been said about Jesus and thought about Jesus. And I think that it's helpful for us to go back to the original sources. It's helpful for us to go back to what Jesus himself said and thought as we determine what we think about him and what we're going to do about it. So if we were to go into the streets of London, just outside the theatre here, and to conduct a survey and ask people, what do you think of Jesus Christ? I think we'd get some interesting answers. If we were to say, give me a really honest description of what you think of Jesus, we'd probably get some even more interesting answers. An honest description can be a very dangerous thing. A trial was undertaken in the South in America, in Mississippi, a few years ago, and the prosecuting lawyer was conducting his first ever trial on his own as the first chair, and he called his first witness to the stand. He was a bit nervous. She was a rather grandmotherly, elderly lady. He approached her and he thought, well, I'm going to start my first ever trial with a really easy question so nothing can go wrong. So he said to her, Mrs. Jones, do you know me? She responded, why, yes, I do know you, Mr. Williams. I've known you since you were a boy, and frankly, you've been a big disappointment to me. You lie, you cheat on your wife, you manipulate people, you talk about them behind their backs. You haven't the brains to realise that you'll never amount to anything more than a 2-bit paper pusher. I know you. The lawyer was stunned, and not knowing how to recover, he pointed across the courtroom and he said, Mrs. Jones, do you know the defence lawyer? She said, oh yes, I've known Mr. Bradley since he was a youngster too. He's lazy, bigoted, and he has a drinking problem. He can't build a normal relationship with anyone, and his law practice is one of the worst in the entire state. Not to mention, he cheated on his wife with 3 women, and one of them was your wife. Yes, I know him. The defence lawyer, Mr. Bradley, nearly died. At this point, the judge asked both lawyers to approach the bench, and in a quiet voice said, if either of you 2 idiots asks her if she knows me, I'll send you both to the electric chair. I wonder what you really think of Jesus. What would your honest answer be if you were asked to describe who he is, what he's like, what he's done? I was leading a week of events at the University of Nottingham last year. And part of the week that we were doing there was to raise interest, I guess, and get conversation going about who Jesus is. And as part of it, at least, we were conducting surveys on the campus to find out, what do British university students think about the world, about purpose, about meaning, about origins, about God, about all sorts of things. And we did over 500 surveys in the course of that week, randomly selected. And out of the 500, my team met 498 people who had a worldview that didn't include any belief in God, no theism at all, and 2 people who were theists. 2 people who believed that there might be a God. In fact, a group of my students were talking to a group of Chinese students, not doing the survey, but just talking with them, and they'd been visiting Britain for 8 months. They were coming towards the end of their time of studying. And when asked, what do you think about Jesus. Who do you think Jesus is? In the course of this conversation, these Chinese students looked incredibly shocked. My team said to them, well, why your reaction? And it turned out that they thought that my team were swearing at them. They had honestly never heard the words Jesus Christ in 8 months of living in Britain, other than as an expletive from the mouths of the British students around them. They had no idea who he was. I suggest to you this morning that we have an enormous task in our country today, at least to encourage people to give Jesus a second look, a closer look. Doesn't he at least deserve our attention? Doesn't he at least deserve investigation? If only on the basis that after 2,000 years since he lived and died on earth, he's still this extraordinarily towering figure, at least in our civilization. My colleague at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, Tom Price, became a Christian studying philosophy at Reading University. And he said this, he said it struck him that one person in 60 billion who stands out deserves a second look. H.G. Wells called Jesus the most dominant person in human history. The historian Philip Schaff describes the overwhelming influence that Jesus has had on the subsequent history and culture of the world. He wrote this Jesus of Nazareth, without money and arms, conquered more millions than Alexander, Caesar, Muhammad, and Napoleon. Without science, he shed more light on things human and divine than all philosophers and scholars combined. Without the eloquence of schools, he spoke such words of life as were never spoken before or since. And he produced effects upon people which lie beyond the reach of the orator or the poet. Without writing a single line, he set more pens in motion, furnished the themes of more sermons, orations, discussions, learned volumes and works of art and songs of praise than the whole army of great men of ancient and modern times. Jesus has exerted this extraordinary influence on humankind, perhaps more than any other individual. And this is despite the fact that his character often ran counter to accepted norms. In the ancient world, virtues were appreciated, virtues like courage and wisdom, but never humility. People were divided by class delineation, divided on the basis of socioeconomics or education. Cicero wrote, rank must be preserved. But Jesus' life as a foot-washing servant has led to the adoption of humility as an admired virtue in subsequent cultures. Historian John Dixon writes this: it's unlikely that any of us, Christian or not, would aspire to this virtue were it not for the historical impact of Jesus' crucifixion. Our culture, he writes, remains cruciform long after it stopped being Christian. Jesus, perhaps the most controversial person to have ever lived, perhaps the most influential person to have ever lived. Nobody has attracted in equal measure such devotion and criticism. And so today, as we think about who Jesus is, taking one of his phrases, one of his statements about himself, consider Jesus. Think about him for yourself. Let's do that together. From John's Gospel, chapter 8 and verse 12. Jesus Christ says this: I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. Let's begin there for a moment at the end of the sentence. In darkness. What does that mean? Well, perhaps darkness is a description of reality that you can resonate with. In the last few months and years in Britain, we've heard about the systematic sexual and physical abuse of young people who've grown up in care. 1,400 young girls in one town in the north of England, hundreds in Oxford, where I work. We've seen pictures of the beheading of Western journalists and aid workers with a butcher's knife. And it's no longer really news anymore. It's certainly not the top of the news item when someone is beheaded in the Middle East. We saw on our screens the impact of 2 earthquakes in Nepal. Just yesterday, we read reports of a boat filled with Burmese people turned away from Thailand and just sent with a bit of extra water into international waters to who knows where. Human misery. Now, while many of us enjoy happiness and we enjoy all sorts of positive experiences as well, we know that word darkness as a description of the reality of our world is true. Closer to home, we see darkness in the families in our country. Childline reported recently that self-harm is now in the top 5 concerns for 12 and 13-year-olds. 5 years ago, it didn't make it into the top 10 concerns, but today it makes it into the top 5 concerns for 12-year-olds. Many of us struggle with feelings of anxiety, disappointment, broken relationships, the struggle to process the violations of our personal dignity, the darkness in the world that you and I live in is real, and we all know that to be the case. This is a reality for my friend who lost her child, her baby died last year. This is true for my friend who, in his 40s, has just for the first time shared with the people that he knows that he was sexually abused as a child. It's true for the person in my church whose child has been relentlessly bullied at school. The darkness of our world is real. And it shouldn't be anything that we're prepared to sweep under the carpet. It's a critical question of our generation. Darkness is real. Now, it may come as a surprise to people, particularly people outside of the church, to hear that a suffering world, a world where darkness is a reality that is felt by all of us, is not denied or shied away from by the Bible. You see, often when people think about faith, they imagine faith as a fantasy. It's a leap into the unknown, and it's an embracing of unreality that will help you somehow get through the pain of life, a bit like a drug that you take that lifts you for a while. But it doesn't bring you into a sustained place of deliverance from that situation. People imagine that faith is a bit like a comfort blanket in a fantasy world, and that when you become a Christian, you're invited to enter into a sort of bubble where we play a game called Let's Pretend. We go to church and we just close our eyes and we think, let's not think about reality, let's delude ourselves together and have a lovely time inside the bubble. That couldn't be further from the truth of what Jesus does and says. The Bible devotes time to describing and empathizing with the human condition. I have 3 children. I have twins who are 9 and another one who's 6. They're all boys. And I heard this story of a little girl who was 6, and it made me smile. She was doing a project on birth at school. And she went to her mother and said, "Mummy, How did I come to be born? Her mother was a little bit embarrassed. She wasn't ready to have that conversation with her daughter. So she just said, well, darling, a big fat bird called a stork flew over our house and dropped a blanket with a baby in it into our back garden, and we took you in. The girl looked a little concerned and said, Mummy, how did you come to be born? And the mother, not really knowing how to stop digging herself out of this hole, said, well, a big bird flew over Granny's back garden, and a blanket with a baby inside it was dumped there, and that was me. The girl went back to school the next day and said in her project, there hasn't been a natural birth in our family for 3 generations. It's a human tendency to avoid facing unpleasant realities, or to be clear when we feel unclear, when we feel uncomfortable. Do you know what? The Bible does not do that around the issues of darkness, pain, suffering. Jesus' objective is not to soothe away your trouble with a hallucinogenic palliative, to ask you to pretend that all is well, to dull the pain for a little while with a little bit of delusion. Jesus Christ invites us to face reality, to see things as they really are. This is actually in stark contrast with rival worldviews. It's very ironic to me that one of the major objections people have to Christian faith is that it's about pretense, it's about delusion, it's about unreality. You see, in the writings of the most articulate defenders of the idea that there is no God, this question is also examined, of darkness, of pain. Dawkins tells us the universe we observe has the properties we should expect if there's no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. There's no good, no evil. These categories that we feel so deeply are actually ultimately unreal. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote this. He said, Dostoevsky, who was a really deeply committed Christian, the Russian author, I'm sure many of you've read his books, but Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, Dostoevsky once wrote, if God does not exist, everything would be permitted. And that is the starting point for existentialism. Everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist, and man is as a consequence forlorn, for he cannot find anything to depend on, either within or outside of himself. Sartre goes on in another place describing a character, saying this, there would be for him no good or evil unless he thought them into being. Fantasy, good and evil. No good and evil, no framework for purpose or meaning. Or in contrast, the Bible teaches that the universe was designed by a rational, holy, loving God. That human beings were creatures created with the capacity to make moral choices and with extraordinary dignity. So where does this darkness come from then, if we've been created by this good and loving God? Well, the Bible does talk about this good God specifically creating us with the capacity to choose and the capacity to love. And for love to exist, freedom must exist. I was speaking to a group of students a few months ago on campus and exploring some of these questions about Christian faith. And I asked them to imagine, many of them were first years, I asked them to imagine that you have just arrived at university and you've had your first term and you've made so many friends and you've fallen madly in love for the first time. And smiles sort of, began to appear on faces. And you've discovered this amazing relationship and this wider community of people that really get you, and it's just fantastic. And then you go home for the Christmas holidays and you're using your mum's computer, and you realise that before you went to university, because your mum loves you so much, she was a bit worried about you and she thought no one would like you. So she made contact with the people that were going to be living in your halls of residence, and she paid some of them to be your friend. And in particular, she found this kind of attractive person that she thought you might like, and she coerced him to take you out. How would you feel? The smiles disappeared. We all know that for love to be real, it can't be coerced. I was talking to David earlier about Birmingham. I grew up in Birmingham, and when I was there as a teenager, I became friends with a girl whose parents were trying to force her into a marriage with someone she'd never met. She was 15 and she was afraid, and she had good reason to be afraid, because the previous year her cousin had been in the same situation. And when she tried to say no to this marriage and tried to run away, her cousin had been knocked down by a car in the street and dragged home and forcibly taken out of the country and married off, and no one had heard of her since. My friend Shabs was 15 years old, and she knew with absolute certainty. There were lots of things she didn't know, but the one thing she knew with absolute certainty was that she wanted to, in her life, have the possibility of loving and being loved. And she felt, without having studied philosophy, without having looked at free will, she just knew that she was capable of giving and receiving love, and that should not and could not be compelled by another person. For love to be real, it must be freely offered. Darkness has come into the world as a result of that freedom. But in this extraordinary statement that Jesus makes, we're not left there. We're not told, come to church and pretend. Religion is a fantasy, it's a drug that will lift you out of the harshness of the world. Our reality is described and explained. But we're not just left there by Jesus. We're not just left there by God with an explanation, or even with a kind of empathetic, even with a kind of compassionate, poor you're in this situation of this dark world. Because Jesus has come. Light has come. Darkness is real and it really hurts, but light has come into the dark world that we all know. This is an astonishing claim that Jesus Christ is making. He says, I am the light of the world. He shows us that he understands our human condition. And he claims that he is the only one who's able to really deal with it. You see, light extinguishes darkness. Light does all sorts of things. Light opens our eyes. We see things more clearly in the light. Jesus, in presenting himself as the light of the world, is not saying, come to me and be a little bit less clear about how awful things are, see things through my rose-tinted glasses. No, he's saying, see more clearly in my presence. He's about truth and reality, not confusion or deception. Light reminds us that we're not forgotten. Think about the relief you feel when you're in a dark place and you don't know what you're doing or where you're going, and somebody switches on the light. It's an extraordinary feeling of relief. You realize I'm no longer alone. The direction you need to go in becomes clear. Jesus is claiming, I am the light of the world. Coming to know him is a lot like having a light switched on in our dark hearts. The light can be a searchlight, a rescue light. And when we see it, we think and we realize deliverance has come. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've needed that kind of rescue. I remember very clearly being stuck in a sandstorm in no man's land between Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. I'd been part of a small team taking Bibles into Afghanistan and meeting the Taliban military leaders in their headquarters and telling them something about who Jesus is. That's a story for another time. We were trying to get home using the same route that we'd come into the country with, but the Turkmen guards wanted a bribe. They wouldn't let us back in. It was about 1 kilometre of no man's land, landmines on either side, the Taliban behind us, the Turkmen guards in front of us. And into this situation of despair, we didn't have enough money to bribe the Turkmen guards, and our water bottle was reducing rapidly. There were 3 of us. The sandstorm began. It was the middle of the day. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Unbelievably hot in the desert. And the storm came. And it was terrifying. It was absolute darkness in the middle of the day. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. It was completely disorientating. Remember, there are landmines on either side of this track. The sand was blowing into our faces. I swear I aged about 10 years in that 2 hours. It was like being sandblasted in the face. Dark, frightening, disorientating. Into that darkness, 2 headlights shone after about 2 hours. I cannot describe to you the relief we felt. A Red Cross truck came through the border and rescued us. And when I asked him, how often do you come through here? He said, oh, not very often. I said, well, what do you mean? Like once a week or once every 2 months or every day? He said, about once every 3 months. The relief of rescue, that those lights beaming through somehow the sandstorm meant to us. That's what Jesus is claiming to be in the reality of our dark world. A rescue light, a deliverer who tells us darkness is real. What you're experiencing in this world is true. It's a reality. You're not being asked to deny or pretend it doesn't hurt or it isn't real. But Jesus is saying, I'm the light that has come into this dark world. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. He will have the light of life. In him or her, Jesus' light will shine. And he ultimately does this through the cross. He ultimately deals with the darkness of our world through the cross. The message of the Bible isn't just this diagnosis, oh, the world is dark, the human heart is dark. And that's a consequence of freedom and the capacity of love. He comes into the world he's created in history. His light exchanged for our darkness. The gospel writer Mark, who was recording Peter's eyewitness testimony, says this. He says, when the centurion, that was a Roman officer who was an expert in execution, when the centurion who stood in front of Jesus saw how he died, he concluded, surely this man was the Son of God. He'd seen thousands of executions, but he recognized something different was happening here. You see, at the cross, Jesus suffered with us and for us, the light of the world, bearing our darkness, paying the price for us. A cartoon has been found on the walls of the ruins of ancient Rome, and it shows how extraordinarily radical this message is of a God who would enter a dark world and identify with people. Remember, the Roman gods, the Greek gods are away, far off. They're projections, emanations of man's imagination. And so this cartoon depicting the Christian message has the body of a man hanging on a cross. But in the cartoon, the man's head is actually the head of a donkey. It's a grotesque satire. And underneath this image of a man's body with a donkey head is an even stranger image of a young man kneeling with his hand raised towards it, and the inscription says, he worships his God. Utterly derisory to the Greco-Roman world, a God who would enter the suffering world that we all know, and that would cause someone to worship. But I suggest to you that this is the heart, the unique heart of the Christian faith. Not denial, not delusion, not let's pretend. Not put on the comfort blanket in a nice bubble for church on Sunday. But reality as you and I know it and experience it, as our friends, as our communities experience it and know it. Described. And not just described, empathized with, compassion for the brokenness of the world, but not just description and compassion and empathy, presence and entering in to the suffering world. The light of the world comes, and Jesus suffers with us. Gandhi said, the cross of Christ is the most overwhelming aspect of the Christian faith, and it is singularly unique. At the cross, he defeats evil and darkness through his suffering. The cross shows us the light of the world bearing this darkness for us on our part. The cross also shows us a God of love who suffers with us, not remote, not transcendent in the clouds, but Jesus entering our world of sweat and tears, experiencing unimaginable pain, betrayal, abuse on our behalf. My 3 children are very good tennis players, and the downside of that, as their mother, is that I have to drive them around the country to all sorts of tournaments for them to compete. And my 6-year-old is particularly good. My bragging moment right now is that he plays for his county under-8 team at the age of 6. So there you go, that's over and done with. You've got the mental picture that he's good. Anyway, Benji suffers rather badly from car sickness, which is quite unfortunate when you have to go to all these far-flung places to play. And the 4 of us were in the car, the 3 children and me, and they'd all been playing tennis, and we were driving home. We stopped to get some food at the petrol station. And the 3 of them were standing there. I was just queuing up to pay. And the twins came to me and said, "Mummy, he's gonna blow." And they were standing back, going backwards like this. And we turned, and for some reason, a sort of small crowd had gathered. And Benji was looking rather green in the face, and the bottom lip was going like this. And I knew exactly what was going to happen, but I can't explain it any other way than my natural instinct was to run towards him. So I sprinted towards him, and as I pulled him into my arms, he erupted with vomit all over me and my hair, all over the floor. People were disgusted, and some people clapped, other people. It was a very strange experience. And the twins were just absolutely horrible. They were just pointing and saying, "It's disgusting, it's awful." And it was one of those family incidents. He's very cross if it's mentioned. At the cross, God comes close to us in Jesus. All our rubbish, our darkness, the violations we've experienced, the abuse we have subjected other people to, the consequences of the decisions we've made, the dirtiness in us goes on to Jesus. He draws us close in this extravagant, extraordinary act of love, offering us forgiveness, the light of life in contrast with darkness, promising to be with us. John Stott put it like this. I need to finish. He says this: I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. The only God I believe in is the one Nietzsche ridiculed as God on the cross. In the real world of pain, how could we worship a God who is immune to it? He says, I've entered many Buddhist temples in Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of a Buddha, legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, and the ghost of a smile around his mouth, a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I've had to turn away, and in imagination I've turned instead to the lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross. Nails through hand and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorns, mouth dry, intolerably thirsty, plunged into God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh, blood, and tears and death. He suffered for us. Jesus, the light of the world, promises if we follow him, we will walk in that light of life. We're no longer held captive to darkness. And so we're left with a question. We're left with an opportunity to respond to him. And for some of us who've never done that, we're offered this newness of life, this new relationship with God, that cleansing, that opportunity to be relieved of the darkness within us, that be dealt with and forgiven. For others of us who have done that before, we're Christians, we're followers of Jesus, but we've become bogged down in the darkness of the world. We've begun to subscribe to the religion of let's pretend, let's just suppress or not think about, let's delude ourselves that these issues aren't there. And Jesus offers this morning his light, the light of life in place of our darkness. I'd like to ask you to stand, and maybe the band can come back.